All right, what's up, everybody? We're back with another Wildlife Cake and Cocktail special. We're at Avid Reader Bookstore in Brisbane's West End for a book launch. We'll actually be chatting with the author today, Harry Sadler, about his new book, The Eastern Curlew. So let's get to it. Our main guest today, Harry Sadler. He's the author of books such as We Both Know 10 Stories About Relationships in 2005, Small Moments in 2007, and Not Birdwatching, Reflections on Noticing Animals in 2015. He's also a blog writer at Monday Story on Twitter. Is that a story a week?
So in my previous life as a fiction writer, I used to do weekly text message stories to a sort of list of subscribers of about 60 people around the world. So
that's fantastic. Text message stories.
And then I would cut them down from 160 characters to 140 characters and put them on Twitter. And then I stopped doing that, but I kept the same username on Twitter. So.
That's fantastic. So you can catch him at Monday Story on Twitter, as well as at his blog Noticing Animals, discussing the ecological and philosophical interactions between humans and animals, starting with the Willy Wagtail bird in 2011, a fantastic little bird. And he's also the joint winner of the 2014 Melbourne Writers Festival Blurb Blog-to-Book challenge for the book Not Birdwatching, which came from the blog Noticing Animals. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
All right, wonderful. And here he is himself. We're here to talk today about his new book, The Eastern Curlew, The Extraordinary Life of a Migratory Bird. Mr. Harry Sadler, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Excellent. I'm very excited. So firstly, congratulations on the release. The book is fantastic. I could barely put it down. I kind of read through it pretty quickly, but it was pretty much less than a week. I couldn't really get my hands off it. It was obviously it's hugely researched and everything, but it's kind of a really cool to get that personal account of people's relationship with not just a single species, but I guess a lot of the migratory birds. That was it's really in depth and really insightful. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you for I guess sending it our way. This is fantastic.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to hear you enjoyed it. And yeah, that personal thing is very important. I don't think there's a person in the entire world who doesn't dedicate their lives to studying animals or writing about animals or just being fascinated by animals if they're not passionately, deeply invested in it. No one thinks, well, I failed out of doctor school or whatever, I may as well become a herpetologist.
No, that's true. No, and look, the passion definitely comes through, and it is important, I guess, to see that, and for a lot of people. Around the wildlife field, getting into it, it really is a bit of a passion thing. You're kind of driven to a lot of the time to follow some of these animals around somewhat. Yeah,
definitely. And the more you look at and notice and observe animals, the more animals you notice around you as well. My favourite sort of analogy to make or comparison to make is we think those of us such as myself, I live in Melbourne, so those of us who live in urban areas in particular, which in Australia is most of us, we tend to think that we live in very wildlife depleted environments, and to an extent we do, of course, but we're also surrounded by much more wildlife than we ever realise. So the example I always give is, well, if you walk into the pub one night and you see a line of ants crawling across the footpath, those ants are wildlife.
No, absolutely. I think, in our kind of more modern, at times disconnected world, it can be easy to kind of lose that connection, which definitely comes through in the book. I guess a lot of it is as mentioned, it is also very well researched and very informative and stuff. Did it take you a lot of time to research this, or being kind of into birds, was a lot of this stuff kind of already in your head waiting to come out in a book?
It was half and half really. So a lot of it was stuff I already knew or stuff I heard, and then I had to research it to confirm it. The starting point of the book actually started with a question, which was I was wondering to myself, these birds have been around for as long as people have, and much longer. The shorebirds as a group are very old, in evolutionary terms, although no one seems to be quite sure when they evolved this habit of long-term migration, long-distance migration. So I was thinking about that, the fact they've been around for so long, they've been around for as long as people have, and they passed through so many different countries. So the question I started with the book was, well, have they in any way imprinted themselves on the cultures in those countries? Are they stories in those cultures? And so that was the starting point for my research, and the answer that the research threw up was, not really.
Not as much as we would have hoped, possibly.
Yeah, which was a little bit of a surprise, a little bit disappointing. Although, as anyone who reads the book will find, there are certainly contemporary artists and modern artists who are doing work based around shorebirds, and a lot of them are driven passionately by the desire to conserve and save these shorebirds. But the more I researched shorebirds trying to find an answer to this question, the more I found out about everything else to do with them. The physiology of their migration, which is extraordinary, the adaptations they have, the fact that they're so enmeshed in our world, because they're in a lot of trouble. The population loss of several species of shorebirds is as much as 8% a year.
Wow.
The Eastern Curlew's population has dropped by 81.7% in the last 30 years.
Ouch.
There are now estimated to be about 30,000 left in the world. And the reason is they're coming into direct conflict with basically our modern way of life, with global trade and global commerce, because the habitats that they rely on, which are largely intertidal mudflats, at least when they're migrating and when they're in Australia, are being developed and concreted over at a rate of knots all around the world, particularly in the East-Asian Australasian Flyway that Australia is in. It's been those mudflats, which, being mud, we don't value as people. We love the coast, but only if it's beach.
Yeah. Look, I mean, that's a really important point. I mean, like as I mentioned, obviously, I'm from people who know the show, I'm a bit of a reptile person. I'm not spending a lot of time wading around in the mudflats myself, but it's a great introduction into some of the species and the awesome overall ecology and biogeography and conservation, and even some of like the weird issues that there is with reclaiming of, I guess, liminal coastal land, or people like to call it that. And then I guess it's those coastal mudflats and the wetlands that these wader birds live in. The book kind of really draws you into that world and gives it a real sense of wonder to those areas. Did you kind of get that impression when you were following through some of those areas, or was it more just stinky, smelly bogs?
So I think everyone who dedicates any time in their lives to studying or working on or working with or trying to save shorebirds becomes, I should clarify, in the UK they're called waders, in the US they're called shorebirds, and in Australia we kind of equivocate between the two, but these days mostly we call them shorebirds. So I think anyone who spends some time dedicating themselves to the shorebirds becomes a bit of a mudflat evangelist. Because it's mud, just the word in English language, mud, is not a good word. Like it's just loaded with negative connotations. We say that somebody's name is mud, or dragged through the mud. It's nothing good happens around mud. So the process of writing this book was a process of really falling in love with mud and discovering how rich an ecosystem intertidal mudflats are. Beneath the surface of the mud, there's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of crabs and worms and snails. It's an incredibly rich ecosystem that's hidden from sight to us. But we're
going to have to hold that thought and move outside here, I believe. We'll be back with more on mudflats in a minute. And we're back here talking to Harry Sadler. We've been moved outside so the avid reader bookshop can have their book club, such as life. So we were talking about mudflats. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right, wonderful.
I was waxing lyrical about mudflats. It's my favourite thing to do.
and look, while they can be a little bit smelly, I mean, mangroves and everything, they don't exactly smell the nicest, but they are, nurseries and breeding grounds and homes for so many other different, species and I guess that invertebrate fauna is like a huge, huge resource.
Absolutely. And that's what has allowed migratory shorebirds to proliferate so much in evolutionary terms. There's 100 species worldwide, and the reason there's so many species is because each one feeds on a slightly different niche within the mudflats, so in different consistencies of mud or different depths of mud. So the Eastern Curlew being the largest migratory shorebird in the world with this incredible long bill, it's like 20 centimetres long or something, and it can reach down crab burrows and get to crabs and other invertebrates that no other shorebird can. And
Right, where like shorter beaked sandpipers and stuff are picking out a different type of invertebrate fauna.
Yeah, and then you have birds like red knots and great knots, which are specialist clam feeders, and they feed on little bivalves, which are sort of 5 centimetres under the surface. And then you have things like the Spoon-Billed Sandpiper, which is critically endangered and endemic to the East-Asian Australasian Flyway, and that relies on really, really, really almost liquid mud, and it sort of sifts it side to side, like the spoonbill that you'd see in wetlands probably around here.
Yeah, right, with its sort of, I guess, a gold panning type technique.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, the fact that the mudflats are so rich allows this incredible proliferation of animal diversity, not just in the invertebrates that live beneath the mud, but as always happens in nature, on the vertebrates that eat the invertebrates as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A huge amount of niche adaptation and a huge amount of different resources. So, why not exploit them? Well, look, we better get on to the subject of our book, The Eastern Curlew, The Extraordinary Life of a Migratory Bird. Fantastic book. And let's talk about the curlew. Numenius madagascariensis. I've been practicing that. I still get it wrong. How'd I go?
It's pretty good. So Numenius, from Greek, I think, for new moon, which is because of the shape of the curlew's beak. So
the crescent moon shaped beak.
Yeah. So there are 8 species of curlew worldwide, and they've all got this sort of long, slightly curved, very thin beak, which looks, I guess, like a crescent moon. So Numenius, new moon. The madagascariensis is
a bit of a misnomer.
Yeah.
Which you actually get into the book, which is fairly interesting. You get into a lot of the taxonomy and even the weirdness of the naming of, firstly calling it the Eastern Curlew, and also being named after Madagascar, after some maybe not so good sampling taxonomy for misplaced.
It's all a bit problematic, and sort of with its origins in 18th century European colonialism, as all wonderful things do. So the best guess, and it's I think people who spend their lives, I guess, taxonomists studying the historical naming of species, have, I think, pretty much reached a consensus on agreeing, look, this is probably the most sensible theory. The best guess we have as to why this bird is called madagascariensis, because it doesn't go within 6,000 kilometres of Madagascar. It's found nowhere near it. The best guess is that somebody collected a specimen sometime in the 18th century, brought it back to Europe. They collected it in Makassar in Indonesia, which is well within the range of the Eastern Curlew. Had brought it back and got the names Makassar and Madagascar mixed up because, if you're an 18th century European colonial explorer / scientist, it's all just stuff over there.
Madagascar and Madagascar. We'll just jam it all together.
And the problem is by taxonomic convention, unless a species gets fundamentally reclassified, unless the Eastern Curlew gets split into two, and think, actually, there's actually 2 species of things we previously called the Eastern Curlew. Unless that happens by taxonomic and scientific convention, you can't rename it. So it's probably going to be misnamed for Madagascar for as long as people are around.
Well, it's stuck with it now. Fantastic animal nonetheless. The largest shorebird in the world, reaching over a kilo. Around a kilo, up to just over a kilo, as I understand. Loves the coasts and coastal wetlands, and using that down curved bill to grab up little crabs, which I believe is their main food source in Australia. Now, in August, they leave the Arctic breeding habitat. About 75% of the global population overwinter here in Australia's east coast, 10,000 kilometres away.
Yep,
so they're coming all the way from the Arctic Circle.
Yep.
That's a huge migration.
Yeah, and one theory that I've heard as to why this migration is that they actually evolved in the Arctic perhaps. And as the Arctic got colder, with ice ages and glaciation and all that kind of stuff, they needed to move further and further away. Because there are very, very good reasons to be in the Arctic in summer, because it's a very brief summer, but an incredibly fertile and productive one. So everything is just going 24/7, hell for leather, growing, reproducing. So
huge amount of mosquitoes and bitey insects up in the air.
24-hour sunshine, so there's lots and lots and lots of food to eat, but only for a very short period of time. So it's a great place to breed if you're a bird, but it's not a great place to spend the whole year.
Yeah, right. So, was it this kind of migratory behaviour that got you really interested, or was it just their impressive size, seeing them firsthand and being a little bit stunned by their, I guess, body form?
Well, actually, it was seeing them in my first ever field guide that I got when I was a kid. Which is I got into birdwatching when I guess I was about 12 years old, and with my pocket money went and bought Simpson and Day Field Guide to the Birds of Australia.
Fantastic book.
Oh, it's still my favourite. And flicking through the pages, and then just like there looms this enormous bird with this just extravagantly long bill. I always compare it to. It's like seeing a giraffe or a picture of a giraffe. A giraffe has this just ridiculously long neck. You think, well, what even is that? How did that happen? How did that evolve? It's just, and there's very good reasons why it evolved. The bill of the Eastern Curlew is the same. It's like I said before, it's only 20 centimeters long, which doesn't sound hugely long, like in people terms, but I think it's 5 times the length of the bird's head. And you see it, and it's just like it's a little bit ridiculous. It is. It's completely ridiculous. And when you see one sort of whip its head around and just like, the bill arrives a week later, kind of thing.
They're fantastic birds. And look, even just the pictures that I've seen of them, I would love to see them in the wild, but obviously it takes a little bit of travel now and again with the amount of movement that they can do. They're going to be in different parts of the world at different times of year. Yeah, although when they're in Australia, they pretty much stay in one place. Well, there are numerous places around the coast where they can be found, lots of hotspots, but each individual curlew will go to the same place on the coast year after year after year. They're very, very site faithful, and because energy conservation is a really big thing for them, because they spend so much of their life putting on fat and feeding frantically to sustain these huge migrations. So once they get to Australia, they're very reluctant to move around the coast. That makes sense. They just come 10,000 kilometres, and they also have to do it again later in the year to get back to their breeding. Exactly. So they get to Australia and they go to their favourite spot on the coast, and they hang around there eating for 6 months. Basically. So they'll be there feeding, and pretty easy to get a photo if you really want to. Yeah, exactly. In Brisbane, Toondah Harbour in Moreton Bay is a really good hotspot. Currently threatened with development, which is not good at all. BirdLife Australia is doing a big campaign to try and prevent that from happening, because it's actually protected under an international treaty that Australia's signatory to, and you'd think, well, in a perfect world, that would just mean it's protected completely, but obviously we don't live in a perfect world. I think then we all know. Well, no, look, there is a lot of issues for the curlew that we're going to be talking about in the East-Asian Australian Flyway as a whole. I just want to bring it back to their migration just for a minute. So that's about 20,000 kilometres that they do per year. The only other there is other species that fly further, like the Arctic tern, doing about 19,000 kilometres, Arctic to Antarctic and back. But they're fully capable seabirds. Yeah, that's right. So what makes shorebird migration particularly just extraordinary, apart from the distance, is the fact that they're not water birds. They can't swim, so they're just flying. And if they get tired and if they fall into the ocean, that's it. They're done for. Yeah. So terns can not only swim on the ocean, but they can dive and feed there as well. Yeah. Which is not to talk down the achievements of the Arctic tern. It's an incredible bird, but the shorebirds are doing it a little bit tougher, and particularly the shorebirds in. So I've mentioned a couple of times this thing, the East-Asian Australasian Flyway. So there are 8 or 9 flyways dotted around the world, and they're basically the migration routes, and each one essentially connects the Arctic to the southern hemisphere. And they're used not just by shorebirds, those 100 species of shorebirds around the world that I talked about, but also in Europe in particular. In North America, there's lots of songbirds that migrate large distances, hummingbirds famously in North and South America.
Australia is in one called the East-Asian Australasian Flyway, and the shorebirds that migrate through the East-Asian Australasian Flyway, they really drew the short straw, I think, because that flyway is mostly water.
Wow.
The flyway that connects the Alaska and that part of the Arctic to South America, obviously is a big landmass. They can fly over land. I mean, they still do fly extraordinary distances. So these birds will fly 5,000 or 6,000 kilometres in a single flight without stopping. It's ridiculous. But at least if you're flying over the Americas, if things get desperate and you hit some weather or something, you can at least touch down.
Yeah, and maybe get some shelter down on the ground somewhere.
You can't really do that over the open ocean if you're not a water bird.
No, that's that's absolutely right. So let's talk about the East-Asian Australasian Flyway. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. The East-Asian Australasian Flyway.
Right. So it's one of the world's great flyways, which are these regular paths of bird migration. So the East-Asian Australasian passes through 22 countries, and there's about 55 migratory species, approximately, that use it to migrate north and south. At the northern end, it begins in Russia and stretches out to about Alaska, covering much of Eastern Asia, including China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Western Pacific on its way down, and comes south to Australia and New Zealand, pretty much ending in Tasmania and parts of New Zealand. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. So yeah, and different birds have got different parts. So most, as you were saying earlier, most of the world's population of Eastern Curlews goes to Australia. A lot of bar-tailed Godwits go to New Zealand. There's no sort of, in fact, they're quite significant, I think, as is my understanding, in Maori culture in New Zealand. So
is there curlew migration to New Zealand?
There is some, and there is to Tasmania as well. In fact, John Gould did his very beautiful illustration of an Eastern Curlew based on a specimen that he collected and shot in Tasmania. The problem is because, as I was saying before, the Eastern Curlew's population has dropped so catastrophically, there's basically not enough of them to go around anymore. So they're very, very rare now in Tasmania, and I think they're also very, very rare now in New Zealand.
Yeah, right. Well, look, I guess one of the issues with flyways, I would imagine, is that amount, the larger your habitat is and the more area you need, the more, especially if you're going to be moving through it, the more you're going to be exposing yourself to risk.
Yeah.
So when you're going through, 22 different countries, that's 22 different types of risk. Essentially, when you consider, what the different states of conservation might be for those different countries or those different locations. And there is, as we mentioned, a lot of reclamation of mudflat land. So basically putting up a seawall, draining it out, filling it with soil, and then trying to build on top of it. Yeah, exactly. And that is that one of the main risks for shorebirds at the moment?
It's the main risk. It's the main reason why they are in so much trouble. Particularly historically in the Yellow Sea, which is the sea between China and the Korean Peninsula, on the northward migration from Australia up to the breeding grounds, which is very, very quick because they've got to race against the clock. They've got to get there in time for the Arctic summer, which, as I said before, is very, very brief. So they basically fly from Australia to the Yellow Sea. They feed up on the Yellow Sea for a bit and then fly on to the Arctic. So it's the single most important area in the whole migration route.
Right, it's like the staging point for the last big flight to the Arctic.
Exactly. And an enormous amount of it has been reclaimed. The population is growing and growing and growing. There are millions and millions of people. I was looking at World Bank statistics, and that they said that the population density in South Korea has doubled in the last 50 years. I think something like 80% of the mudflat habitat in the Yellow Sea has been destroyed. And it's very easy to say, this is a terrible thing that the Chinese people are doing, the Korean people are doing, but it's been reclaimed, a lot of it has been reclaimed for industry and for shipping, which is done for the purpose of getting to countries like Australia the products that we buy from our shops, so it's really part of global consumerism and global trade, which is causing big issues. There is a little bit of glimmer of hope. The Chinese government, quite out of the blue, as they want to do, a few months ago, announced a moratorium on coastal development.
That's fantastic.
It's incredible. And a lot of people, particularly an NGO called the East-Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership, has been doing a lot of work lobbying governments to do something about this coastal development, and BirdLife International as well, of course. So that's a very, very recent development, so it's too early to say what impact that's going to have, but it's encouraging.
I understand there's also been signs of population growth, at least in certain areas. Like some of the Darwin curlew populations seem to, at least on their stopover, the population seems to be stable.
Yeah, so there's a researcher up there named Amanda Lilliman, and she studies the Eastern Curlews, and she's one of the things that the Port of Darwin has done, which is one of the major places where the Eastern Curlews like to hang out up there, is they've created sort of artificial roost sites. So the high tide roosts are very, very important because they need to be safe, but they need to be not too far from the mudflats so that the birds don't waste a lot of energy flying back and forth. And yeah, Amanda has found that the population up there is in the Port of Darwin is actually growing. It's a little bit too early in her research at the moment, as I understand it. She hasn't quite been able to determine yet whether that's because there are more curlews overall, or whether it's just because the curlews from around the coast in Darwin and surrounds are recognising this particular spot as a good place to be, so they're all congregating there.
Right, whether it's a hotspot or whether it's an actual growth.
Yeah, exactly. So it's too early to tell.
That's an encouraging sign, though.
Yeah.
Either way, whether it's a attractive hotspot that they've created, that's a great thing. And if the populations are going up, well, that's also good too, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, hopefully it's a sign of things to come. Back in the Yellow Sea, there's also some indication of changing attitudes in South Korea, which is great. There was a very infamous development finished about 10 years ago in South Korea called the Salmon Seawall, which built the world's longest seawall, about 33.5 kilometres long, on the Salmon estuary, which is about halfway down the west coast of South Korea, and it had, prior to that seawall being built and cutting off the tides, the Salmon estuary had been the single most important site in the Yellow Sea, and the seawall was built and the whole thing was killed.
Yeah, right.
And that was an absolute disaster. It was a calamity. It was a disaster of such great scale that there's some indication that it's maybe started to change attitudes in South Korea. So there have been other reclamation developments, or proposed reclamation developments, or proposed industrial developments along the coast that have been cancelled or put on hold since then. So, I was saying before how we can't sort of put all the blame on China and Korea because we're buying all the products that they manufacture. The same is true of the fact that Australia is not doing great in terms of saving its shorebird habitat either.
No, that's true.
And even though the shorebirds breed in the Arctic, and we tend to think of places where animals breed as their home, they spend most of the year in Australia. They spend 6 months of the year in Australia. So this is really the place where they spend most of their lives. In Australia, we have most of the population lives along the coast, of course, and we've got this very idealised view. We all want to have a coastal lifestyle. We all want to live within sight of the sea. We all want to have a boat or marina or whatever. But our idea of coastal lifestyle is a very particular one, which is golden sandy beaches and
not a lot of mudflats,
marinas and ports and harbours, and not a lot of mudflats.
Well, look, I think one of the other really interesting things that comes out of this, with the way that these birds travel from one side to the other, and the way that I guess globalization issues affect this animal, it does all kind of show how much closer we are to each other. You describe in the book that I think that these migratory birds and these animals that work these flyways help shrink the world and help bring us together.
Yeah,
and that's absolutely true in more ways just than one. In not only do we get to see these same animals, but they're moving the same seeds, and biogeography is the same seeds down the same biogeographic pathways.
They act as seed vectors, so they carry plants from one part from one pole to the southern hemisphere, and so there's all interesting parallels in the flora between the two parts of the flyway, which is I'm sure that's something we could really get into. It's very
yeah. Well, we could talk about this for hours, but look, we do have to wrap it up. I just find it very interesting how not just in terms of economics, but in terms of ecology, these migratory birds kind of bring everybody together a little bit.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges in a flyway like the East-Asian Australasian Flyway is it encompasses not only so many different countries but so many different cultures and so many different languages, and that's a challenge in terms of conservation, but I think it acts as a unifying force between all those different cultures as well, or at least hopefully it can. So
absolutely, and hopefully that way we can approach those kind of global conservation problems a bit more realistically.
Yeah, hopefully so.
Fantastic. Now, so this book starts and ends on the Victorian mudflats. So I guess that's something that you've come to love over this time, and to see a little bit differently, and hopefully maybe everybody else will as well.
I hope so. I certainly hope so.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to Harry Sadler. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting us out here. It's been an absolute joy to talk to you. I can't wait to see the rest of the launch.
No, thanks. It's been really great. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Awesome. And thanks again to Avid Reader Bookstore, everybody. They're at 193 Boundary Street in West End. You can see them at Avid Reader 4101 on Twitter, or on Facebook at Avid Reader Bookshop. You can also check them out at avidreader.com.au. Now, to get involved, you can check out BirdLife Australia and the Shorebirds 2020 project at birdlife.org.au/projects/shorebirds-2020. You can also check out the East-Asian Australasian Flyway partnership at EAAFP. EAAFP. Just put in eaaflyway.net. You can also check out eBird Australia at ebird.org.au to see how the curlews are moving around at absolutely any time. So, guys, jump on those resources. Thanks again, Harry. It's been an absolute joy talking to you. And I guess we'll be hanging around for the launch. And we'll talk to you again very shortly.
Great, thank you.
All right, no worries, guys. Thanks very much to everybody at home. You can catch us on Wildlife Cake and Cocktails on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and more. Plenty more coming soon. Cheers, everyone. Bye.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we stand, the Yagara and the Turrbal people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and any elders who may be here tonight. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and we feel so grateful to be standing on it tonight. Storytelling land in West End.
You can introduce Harry
and I will do a little bit of an introduction to Harry Sadler. Harry is the author of We Both Know, 10 Stories About Relationships and Small Moments. In 2014, he was joint winner of the Melbourne Writers Festival Blurb Blog-to-Book Challenge for his blog Noticing Animals, resulting in his third book, Not Birdwatching, Reflections on Noticing Animals. His non-fiction writing about the ecological, physical and philosophical interactions between humans and animals have been published online in Meanjin and the Wheelers Centre, and in print in The Lifted Brow. He has twice been shortlisted for the Lifted Brows Prize for experimental non-fiction, and that is really, really hard to get even on the shortlist, so congratulations on that. And tonight we're talking about the Eastern Curlew with him and his new book, so welcome him tonight. And I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Chrissy. I'm really glad to be here. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's my great pleasure to meet Harry tonight. I've been wanting to do that for some time. You may know him, if those of you who are on Twitter may know him as Monday Story, which is how I first came to know him online. I can also thank Harry for directing me to Templestowe on the Upper Yarra River in suburban Melbourne to see the local platypuses last year. I was intrigued that he seemed to be writing the story of a single species of bird, the Eastern Curlew. What proportion of bird nerds do we have in the audience tonight? Roughly? Yeah, okay. Well, many of you are probably aware that southeast Queensland is an international stronghold of the species. And so I've perhaps taken it for granted. Harry's book is a reminder of how subtly and easily things that we're familiar with can slip away from under our nose very quickly. I've jumped at the chance to talk to him tonight when the offer came up. Please make him welcome again. We'll get into it. you. But before we do, let's just clear up one little thing. Who knows the bird that Chrissy was talking about? Okay, so for those who aren't aware of the bushstone curlew, they're the ones with the big yellow googly eyes with long legs, and they sound like this.
Yeah, you're on topic.
Is that audible to everybody here?
But you need to point out.
Hold it down the bottom.
Hold it down the bottom of your phone.
Oh, the bottom of the phone, thank you. All right, so
But this is a very different way to the curlew.
that is,
It is,
we're
indeed.
getting to that, yes. I'll tell you something about birdwatching.
We've come here tonight only to clarify this one issue, and then we're out of here.
I'll tell you something about birdwatchers. They're a literal bunch. Okay, so this is an Eastern Curlew.
Go down the bottom. That's better.
Very different.
Oh, yeah,
See, I have the bird up on my phone. You may have been wondering why. Am I using this microphone okay, Chrissy? Okay, so you might have been wondering why a music nerd got roped in to do this conversation. That is because I've been also a birder since I was about 8 years old, and it was actually fellow punk rock birders that turned me onto the world of birds in the early 80s, tearing up the Hume Highway, listening to the Dead Kennedys.
Are they still around? Can you hook me up with them over the weekend?
Yeah, well, Sean Dooley was one of them. In fact.
Really?
Yeah, he was the first of them, and that's kind of my birdwatching origin story, and that was where I was going to start. Every bird nerd I've ever met has their own origin story. What's yours?
Mine is not nearly as cool as punk rock and birds, I'm afraid. Mine, when I was about 12 years old, I grew up in Canberra, and like many Canberrans, my family spent weekends driving 3 hours down to the far south coast of New South Wales, which is a very beautiful part of the New South Wales coast. Am I holding this close enough, by the way?
Yeah, that's good.
One of the places they drove to was a house built in a block of forested land, wet sclerophyll forest with a bit of temperate rainforest mixed in, on very steep slopes, so never been cleared. At the bottom of the slope was a river called the Brogo River. It's near Bega. It's the nearest large town. If any of you are familiar with New South Wales, it's about 45 minutes inland from Bermagui. This house was built, I guess, about 40 years ago, so maybe 35 years ago, by some old friends of my parents, and my parents used to go down there every now and then when no one visited for a while, because these friends spent a fair bit of time overseas, so they sort of roped in various friends of theirs to go and look after the house, etc. And my parents fell in love with it, and very rashly one day my mum said to these friends, well, if you ever thinking of selling the Brogo house, we'll buy it from you. Never think it would never happen. And then shortly thereafter, these friends turned around and said, well, actually. And then my parents thought, God, we've already got one mortgage in Canberra. Now we need to figure out how to finance the second one. So anyway, they did. And we'd go down there a couple of times a month. I'd go down, and the forest there was full of birds. And this is when I was about 10, 12 years old. And the birds would fly into there was a little garden outside the house with no fence, so the garden was all melted into the forest, and the birds would fly into the garden. Being an Australian bush, most of them were honey eaters. One very beautiful bird in particular flew in. I got interested in identifying these birds with my parents' old copy of the Slater Field Guide from the 60s, which is in 2 volumes, and the less colourful birds like the shorebirds are only illustrated in black and white. It was not an ideal field guide. There's one particular honey eater flew in, and it was really beautiful. I'd never seen it before because I was 12 and I was seeing lots of birds for the first time. I tried to find it in this very antiquated, not very good field guide. I couldn't find it at all.
Little Kaylee, I presume.
Yeah, being 12 years old, I thought, well, maybe it's a new species that no one's ever seen before. So I rushed off, when I was back in Canberra, I rushed off to my local bookshop and got a copy of a much superior field guide, the Simpson and Day field guide. that had really great illustrations. I pretty much straight away found out this bird was a bird called the Eastern Spoon-Bill, which is just stunning. It's
And you
wonderful.
have, I don't know if it's exactly the same one. Is
Yeah,
that the same one?
Very, very nearly. So I'm still very loyal to the Simpson and Day field guide. It's been through many editions.
Show the audience. This is a much loved.
You can't quite see.
Item.
You might be able to see if I hold up to the light and you can see the glistening. You can't quite see from there, but both covers have fallen off and I've taped them back on. There's a big crack down the spine. It's been through a lot of weather, this thing. I've had it for like 20 years. So yeah, it's a treasured item.
So to pick up on a theme from this book that I'll ask you to expand upon here, you've taken what for most people will be a seemingly small subject, a very niche one, a single species of bird, and you've made a whole world out of it.
Yeah, no one's quite put it to me like that before. I studied biology at uni at the ANU in Canberra, and very quickly in the course of my degree found out that I didn't have the makings of a scientist. I just have the right kind of mind.
We share the same problem too.
but I was still interested in birds. But because my undergraduate life was in the biology department, and biologists dedicate their entire lives to studying one species in excruciating detail. So I guess it didn't seem unusual to me to write a whole book about one species. But that's an interesting point.
One thing that surprised me early in the book was that although you've had an interest in the natural world since your childhood, you actually only encountered your first Eastern Curlews a few years ago. What was it that made this bird become, if you will pardon the pun, a full-fledged obsession so quickly?
So, for starters, when you grow up in an inland city like Canberra, you're always thinking of the coast. So my family wasn't a big swimming family, weren't big on going to the beach and swimming, but I loved going to the coast and looking at the ocean and seeing things that were on the coast and seeing things I couldn't see at home. When I got this field guide, because it presents the bird life of an entire continent, which is close to 1,000 species in Australia. I think it's 900 and something. Anyway, a lot of species. Only a very small handful which are found in Canberra. So there are a lot of birds in here that I've never seen, and in particular, being landlocked, being interested in coastal things because it was different, and being interested in birds. I spent a lot of time flicking through this in my bedroom floor and sort of stumbled very early upon this page after page after page after page of these birds called migratory shorebirds, which are, there's about 30 odd species that come to Australia, and they were astonishing because I read about them. I read that they migrate huge distances to the Arctic. There's many of them found in Australia. Most of them look the same. It's almost impossible to tell them apart, except for this one, which in the field guide, which I always remember in my memory the way you do when you have childhood memories that are exaggerated. I always remember flicking through the field guide and seeing this enormous bird looming over the page. It really doesn't. It really doesn't.
It's like a really glamorous bin chicken.
Yeah, exactly. It is. So you might be able to see. So this is a page of shorebirds. This is the curlews. This one is this one. Here is the Eastern Curlew, and in my mind's eye, in my childhood memory, this bird is sort of about that big, but it's not on the page. But it just, I don't know, it just stood out, and particularly it stood out because it's got this extraordinarily long bill, which is, I think the statistic is the bill is 5 times the length of its head or something. It's just an extravagant contraption. The comparison I always make is that it's basically the giraffe of the bird world. You know, a giraffe has this preposterous long neck, and an Eastern Curlew has a preposterous long bill. And again, it's like a giraffe, it's an adaptation for feeding. So animals that are, and it's also the largest shorebird in the world, largest migratory shorebird in the world. So animals that are larger than all their near relatives, animals that are exaggerated in some feature, animals that are just strange, they stand out and they capture the youthful imagination, or not just the youthful imagination. So from an early age, I was just fascinated by this bird that represented and symbolised so many things that interested me, being coastal and going to exotic places in the world, and being like strange and bizarre and not something I was ever going to see at home.
I want to be careful about how much knowledge we can assume of the audience at this point.
Yeah.
And one of the humanity's enduring fascination with bird life is very much connected to flight.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing that quite rivals the flight of a shorebird, and I won't necessarily say a curlew in particular, but given their size, they've got more weight to carry than most shorebirds. I just wanted to quickly, before I ask you to go on and potentially describe this, is there anyone in the audience who's not familiar with the distances that these birds cover? The actual migration flight of the curlew? Okay, we're going to have to get you to fill them in on the sheer extravagance and enormity of what the life cycle... can you give us a brief snapshot of what a curlew does twice a year?
Okay, so it breeds in the Arctic, for the Eastern Curlew, the main breeding sites are the Kamchatka Peninsula, which is very, very remote and underdeveloped, undeveloped, I should say.
The peninsula in Russia, north of Japan.
And the delta of the Amur River, which forms the border between China and Russia. So it breeds up in the Arctic, in the wilds of the Arctic. It spends 6 months of the year in Australia. Obviously, it needs to get between those 2 points. And it does it very, very, very quickly, particularly on the northward migration. It flies basically in 2 hops. So it'll fly from Australia. Shorebirds, often in Australia, when they're leaving Australia, they congregate in Roebuck Bay next to Broome. It's a big staging post. So they'll gather there. They'll fly up to the Yellow Sea, which is the sea between China and the Korean Peninsula, and that's about 5,000 or 6,000 kilometres. They'll do that in one flight, a single flight, and they're not soaring birds. They're not gliding birds. They're flapping birds. So they're flapping the entire way. They'll feed up, and then they'll do another hop, 5,000 or 6,000 kilometres again, up to the Arctic.
And to do that requires enormous energy, and I think this is something that we need to get across to those who aren't familiar with this life cycle. To be able to do this twice a year, these birds need to feed more or less constantly. They gorge themselves. They become, in your words, by the time they're ready to fly, they are morbidly obese. They are very fat birds, but by the time they come down, they are very skinny birds, and they're very exhausted birds.
So they will nearly double their body weight in fat. A shorebird that is at peak migration fitness, that is ready to go, 80% of its body is fat. Sorry, no, I've got that wrong. Sorry, they put on, slightly less than 50% of their body. They put on 80% of their body weight in fat, which are slightly less spectacular, but still pretty spectacular. Not only do they do that, they have all sorts of extraordinary other adaptations. Obviously, the ability to feed quickly and put on enormous amounts of fat very, very quickly, because they do that in a matter of weeks. They really gorge themselves in the weeks leading up to migration. So they can put on fat very quickly, which obviously is a pretty impressive adaptation in itself. They will also, before they migrate, their less essential internal organ systems that they're not going to use on the migration per se, like the reproductive system, which they don't need while they're migrating, like the digestive system, which they don't need while they're flying. Those will shrivel up to almost nothing, like a balloon deflating inside their body to make room for more fat and to make them a bit lighter. Then they'll burn off that fat while they're flying. Then they'll get to the Yellow Sea and they'll feed and just pile on the fat again and then burn off the fat again, and then they'll get up to the Arctic. Most species, not so much the Eastern Curlew, but most species, while they're doing that, will also molt into completely new and completely different plumage, into breeding plumage. And then when they get up to the Arctic, they've been feeding in Australia and in the Yellow Sea on invertebrates in the intertidal mudflats, and when they get up to the Arctic, they change their diet and their feeding habit completely. And they do that twice a year. So they just go through extraordinarily bodily and metabolic changes.
The corollary here, the subtext, and I wonder how many people might be picking up on it, is if these birds do not get enough to eat before they fly, and then they touch down in These birds are also very site faithful, which means that they will migrate to the same staging posts year after year. A very important site is right here. Moreton Bay is actually a stronghold for these birds.
Yeah, that's right.
If they go to the site that they've been visiting year after year, generation after generation, and find that that place is not there, and they are exhausted and starving by the time they touch down, they die.
That's right.
That is the sad.
And many species of migratory shorebird are critically endangered, including the Eastern Curlew. The population loss of some species is as high as 8% a year, where the population is dying. The Eastern Curlew's population has declined. I don't like this word decline because it's very passive. It's very like, no, that's nothing to do with us. It's like just a natural thing. It's, yeah, basically, through our actions, because we're developing intertidal mudflats, which is destroying habitat, so we're directly causing these losses. Anyway, the reduction in the Eastern Curlew's global population has been 81.7% in the last 30 years.
That comes mostly through habitat loss, through the reclamation of mudflats.
And it's largely through the destruction of intertidal mudflats, because
I'll get you to come back. But
I'm just about to start waxing lyrical about mudflats.
We're going to talk about mud. There's a lot of mud in this book. Did you have a sense, though, as you were writing the Eastern Curlew, or even before you wrote it, that what you were actually writing was not so much a piece of science writing as a tragedy?
I don't want to be too much of a downer, but I think it's impossible if you're ecologically aware in the early 21st century, and you're spending your time writing and thinking about birds or about animals and species and the environment. I think it's impossible to not be aware that you're working in the genre of tragedy.
Yeah, is that also a tragedy for us as well as a tragedy for biodiversity and for birds themselves?
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, people often talk about, well, there might be like undiscovered benefits to people, medicinal or whatever, all these animals, or all these forests we're logging in the Amazon or whatever. What about all the medicines that could come out of those plants? But the natural world and animals and plants and all the other species, all the other great species, I think they have innate value. I don't think it has to be an economic value. I don't think it has to be directly a value to people. I think they're valuable just because of the fact that they exist, just because they're there, and that's something I feel very strongly.
Ultimately, you felt that you had to follow the birds to northern China and to Korea. It's almost like a kind of method acting for writers. Perhaps a few of us in here, including myself, have twitched birds in Australia, sometimes covering thousands of kilometres to find a vagrant or track down rare endemics. This is a whole other level of dedication, flying across the world to follow a species that you're actually already well familiar with.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, that's a very lovely way to put it. I don't want to deflate that beautiful picture, but it was very, very pragmatic for me. I was writing this book, and I thought,
De Niro of birders, Harry.
Well, I thought, as a reader, if I read a book about a bird that undergoes this extraordinary migration, and then if the writer then didn't at least partly follow the migration, I feel like, what are you doing? What are you you've overlooked an obvious thing that you need to do. So it's inconceivable to me to write about migration and then at least not partly follow the migration. I didn't, unfortunately, get all the way up to the Arctic.
Yes, I was going to say that must have been a great temptation to follow the birds to their breeding grounds on Kamchatka.
It was a great temptation, unfortunately, and this is going to, again, lift the veil on the romantic and magical world of writing. I have a day job, which has nothing to do with writing, and I had 3 weeks of annual leave up my sleeve, and they were used all on going to China and Korea, and I didn't have any leave or any money spent to go to the Arctic. It would have been lovely to do so.
So simply prohibitive. We are in Queensland, which most of us know as being the home of white shoe developers back in the 80s, when the crash of populations of shorebirds truly began. Particularly, the White Shoe Brigade loved to develop coastal locations like Sanctuary Cove a bit further south and Raby Bay here. One of the most famous of those developers was the late Keith Williams, I vividly remember hearing him on television describing Port Hinchinbrook up north, which he wanted to build a resort on, as a stinking mud hole. Would you like to speak up for mud, beautiful mud, at this point?
So,
It's because mud is pretty much the setting for this book.
absolutely. So when I started writing the book, I didn't disparage mud. You know, I was from a very every habitat is beautiful in its own way kind of thing. But I wasn't particularly attached to mud. But
You get very attached to mud. You can get well too attached to mud if you go walking.
Indeed. Inevitably, in the course of writing this book, I spent a lot of time looking at a lot of mud. And I think everyone who spends time studying or researching or just watching migratory shorebirds becomes, over the course of time, a bit of a mudflat evangelist. That's just a bad name for you. And I very much became one. So, mud is... In the English language, mud is not good. There's no positive connotations in the English language. Mud, you know, if someone's name is mud, you get raked through the mud. Everything about mud is bad and negative. Intertidal mudflats. So these are the mudflats that are covered up by the sea at high tide and then exposed at low tide. So they're in the intertidal zone. They are incredibly rich and productive ecosystems.
Think about this just for a moment. We'll keep on going with this, but think about this for a moment just in the context of Brisbane. Why do we have a beach at South Bank on the river? We have a beach because there's no beaches in Moreton Bay. You have to go out to Stradbroke or down the Gold Coast or Sunshine Coast if you want to actually see surf beaches. So we've created our own little artificial beach by the river, you know, not far from here. Because we don't like mud, and Moreton Bay is all bloody mud.
Yeah. So, we love the coast in Australia. We all want to live by the coast. Most of us do live by the coast. But we have a very particular view of what that coast should look like. It should be either golden sandy beaches and surf, or somewhere with a marina. Depending on your wealth level.
And yet mudflats are actually, you know, when we think of biodiversity, we tend to think of, it's certainly in Queensland, we think of rainforest, you know,
Exactly.
which is attractive and tranquil, and you know, you throw all sorts of lovely adjectives at it, and things are very, you know, relatively conspicuous there, even if we have to ferret them out a bit.
Yeah.
Whereas mud seems, on the face of it, to be, in terms of biodiversity, it seems more monocultural.
Yeah.
Actually, that is not the case.
No, it's brown, or sometimes it's grey. Neither of those are good colours. The marketing people are not doing a good job there. It looks flat. Looks like there's nothing happening. Beneath the surface of the mud, an extraordinary array of microorganisms, invertebrates. And again, invertebrates also have a problem. People don't care too much about invertebrates, even though they're the foundation of pretty much everything else that goes on Earth. So beneath the surface of the mud, it's just swarming with crabs and bivalves and snails and worms. There's so much going on under the mud. It's just an incredibly rich ecosystem. And in fact, one time a lot of the book is set on French Island, which you may not be familiar with. Perhaps know Phillip Island in Victoria, just east of Melbourne. French Island is a great big island immediately above Phillip Island, so just east of Melbourne. It's mostly national park, and that's because it's very important for shorebirds. I was walking there along the coast one time, walking sort of along the edge of the tidal zone, and sort of seeing the sea out, and the mud was kind of speckly, sort of interesting kind of textured speckly thing, and I could hear all this sort of popping, crackling kind of noise. Just, it seemed like ambient background seaside noise. And then I actually took the time to look down, and I realised that all those speckles that I could see all the way, to the horizon, not to the horizon, but the distance, and all that noise was blue soldier crabs, little round crabs that big, and looking down, and I was just surrounded by them. There were millions of them out there, and I try to be a fairly ecologically aware person. I hadn't even noticed it. It just been background noise, and
Probably the background noise of them crunching under your shoes.
Oh no, they're pretty good at getting out of the way. So, and that's why mudflats are so valuable, because there's millions and millions and millions of tiny animals.
Human beings have shared mudflats with the birds for millennia.
Yeah, exactly. So
why don't we value them more? Certainly, I mean,
That's a good question.
you saw in Korea, I think, or
yeah,
in China.
People still have a traditional, well, somewhat traditional lifestyle, at least traditional foraging habits up there, which is people who live along mudflats in Korea and China spend a lot of time, and they have for generations and generations shellfishing, out on the mud, getting completely covered in mud, digging up clams and all sorts of things to sell or to eat. It's not just birds, not just non-humans, but humans who also make use of the mud. But again, these are not very wealthy communities, and it's very easy for development to just run roughshod over them. So people are losing their livelihoods as well as birds losing their meal.
In Gangwon, South Korea, I hope that pronunciation is correct, you speak of seeing a group of 15 Eastern Curlews, and that was at that point the most you had ever seen in your life, and your excitement at seeing that is quite palpable. Reading that as someone who's been birdwatching since the early 80s and who arrived in Brisbane, again, one of the strongholds of the curlew, made me very sad. I can certainly remember seeing flocks of several hundred of the birds.
And if you go back 100 years, there are reports of flocks of thousands of them. It's just this is the diminished world that we live in, unfortunately.
By the way, if anyone wants to pick me up at the end of this, it is still very possible to see Eastern Curlews both in certain parts of Moreton Bay, but particularly also at Seawall, just to the north of here. There's a high tide roost near Bribie Island, which is probably the best place to go to see them. You've actually brought out
so I've completely forgotten about this. I've got a bit of show and tell. When Troy were talking about trying to lift people's spirits, I very much like it if this makes it back to me, by the way.
We're going to pass it around.
I was thinking of passing this around. So I was spoken about French Island before. I was working on revising one of the drafts of the book a year or two ago on French Island. It was September, the newly created grand final long weekend in Melbourne. And September is also when the Eastern Curlews and other shorebirds arrive back in Australia, particularly in Victoria and the south of their range. When they migrate, they've been flapping the whole way. Their feathers obviously get very worn and damaged. They need to moult into new feathers, so they drop feathers. I was walking back to my campsite, saw this feather upside down on the beach, picked it up, and lo and behold, so I'm going to pass this around. And if you look very carefully at the tip of it, you can see the damage and the fraying. And let's think when you're looking at this feather and a bunch of other feathers like it carried a bird 10,000 kilometres.
And that tiny bit of wear that you see at the end decreases performance, decreases aerodynamics. So that's why they have to molt those feathers. Okay. While that's going around, it's actually a nice thing to point out that when we talk about conflict between these birds are kind of on a collision course in a way, and what we're talking about is a conflict between the tangible and the ineffable. And the birds are the ineffable part of this. This bird that's kind of like a ghost in our lives that we're probably not even aware of.
And particularly because of their lifestyle, because they migrate such huge distances, because the most dramatic part of their life, the breeding period, is in incredibly remote places where nobody is and nobody sees them, because they're somewhat ephemeral, so they'll be here for a few months and then they're gone. They migrate. They fly 3,000 metres up into the sky and get the jet stream behind them and migrate. So even when they're migrating, we don't see them. So it's very easy, literally and figuratively, to lose sight of the fact that these birds are out there.
Yeah. the greatest, I'm afraid we're going to get back to the sad stuff again. The greatest tragedy in this book, and the saddest chapter, touches on the construction of the Somalian Seawall in Gunsan in Korea. Can you tell us about this seawall, why that's important, and the extent of the, there's no other way to put it, absolutely catastrophic effect of that development has had on shorebird numbers, not just the curlew, but certainly the curlew as well.
Yeah, so I'll just give you a bit of info about the Yellow Sea in general. So we're talking about the Yellow Sea before, the sea between China and Korea, and how that's the major stopover point, particularly for the northward migration, which is the major refueling point. The reason for that is because the mudflats there are phenomenal. This sea has been fed for tens of thousands of years, or hundreds of thousands of years, by a number of very large rivers that drain out of the mountains in China and Korea. They're depositing enormous amounts of sediment. When the tide goes out on the Yellow Sea, the mudflats can extend for 5 to 10 kilometres offshore. They are absolutely astonishing. And drainage channels sometimes from the farmland around the Yellow Sea kind of cut through into the mudflats, and you can see that this mud is metres deep. So yeah, that's why the Yellow Sea is so important. The Yellow Sea is also home to millions and millions and millions of people. The population is booming and has been for a long time. I was looking at World Bank statistics because that's the fun kind of research you get to do when you write. And according to the World Bank, the population in South Korea, the population density in South Korea has doubled in the last 50 years. And South Korea in particular is very, very mountainous. It has very little flat land. When I was there, I was there for 2 weeks, and I sort of covered the northwest quarter of South Korea, and every available inch of flat land someone was growing food on. Like where there was a metre wide strip of land along a car park, someone was growing food and harvesting it. So the environment there is very understrained, and because of that, an enormous amount of the Yellow Sea mudflats in Korea and in China has been destroyed. So the term is reclaimed, which is very, very problematic because it...
Very loaded word.
Yeah, it's extremely loaded because it implies that this land is ours and we're taking it back from nature. It basically means that a seawall has been built to stop the tide coming in, and then the land behind the seawall has been developed and turned into farmland or turned into factories, etc. The Samangum seawall is in South Korea. It's about midway down the west coast of South Korea. Is the most infamous example. Prior to that, the Samangum estuary is a big estuary fed by 2 rivers, or it was. Prior to the development of this seawall, it was the single most important site for migratory shorebirds in the Yellow Sea. And then the South Korean government decided that they wanted to become an economy of the future and build stuff and so over the course of about 10 years, because it was fought through the courts by various NGOs strenuously to no avail, unfortunately, the South Korean government built the world's longest seawall, which is 33.4 kilometres long, and it sealed off the tides in the Samangum estuary. And with that one act, tens or even hundreds of thousands of migratory shorebirds died because the food was no longer available. There are photos of the Samangum estuary was particularly important for knots, so there are red knots and great knots. I think it was great knots. And they're specialised clam feeders, so they feed on clams. So there are photos of the Samangum estuary after it was sealed off, and all the clams, which are desperate for oxygen because the mud they live in was not getting oxygenated because it was not getting replenished by the tide. They've all risen to the surface, which is like the last desperate act that a dying clam does. In that single act of sealing off the Samangum estuary, the global population of the great knot, which is one of the shorebird species that's found all over the world, through that single act of destruction and development, the great knot went from being classified as of least concern to being critically endangered.
And I think if we can actually put this in actual figures, perhaps an even more dramatic example that you've touched on in the book is the tragic story of a tiny and wonderful little bird called the Spoon-Billed Sandpiper. Can you, probably most of you might have seen spoonbills, which is a largish, about the size of an ibis water bird with a spatula-shaped beak. Well, this is a tiny, tiny little sandpiper that you could fit in the palm of your hand that has a similar shaped spatula beak. Very rare. The Yellow Sea was also its primary feeding grounds, and it migrates south to further down to Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Can you give us
the
actual raw numbers for this?
Yeah, so the Spoon-Billed
species?
Sandpiper is endemic to the migration route that Australia is in, which is called the East-Asian Australasian Flyway. It doesn't make it all the way to Australia, as Andrew was saying. It migrates to sort of Myanmar and Thailand. And I can't remember the last time I looked. I think there's like a couple of hundred in the world.
I think it went from something like a few thousand to a few hundred in the space of a very short space of time.
And the reason, so I think I said earlier, there are 100 species of migratory shorebird in the world. About pretty much exactly a third of those are found in Australia. The reason there are so many species is because they've all evolved to feed on a slightly different niche in the mud. And the Spoon-Billed Sandpiper, its niche is really, really sloppy, liquidy mud, and it sifts from side to side looking for little crustaceans and things. And because shorebirds need a very specific type of mud, they go to the same place year after year. Specific sites are very, very important to them. The Spoon-Billed Sandpiper, the same in Gormestry, was it.
One thing I wanted to touch on was that you spoke about the city of Gunsan, where the Somalian Seawall is. You spoke of it being marketed as a dream hub.
Yeah.
I'm sure you must have been conscious of what we'll have to call really first world privilege here, being in countries with huge populations and demand, a huge density of population, as you've already touched on, demand for precious resources.
Yeah.
And you're trying to fight the good fight for migratory shorebirds.
And it is an issue where, it's an issue not just with this specific instance of intertidal mudflat development, but it's development in developing countries or in non-Western countries in general, where we've lived the good life for a long time, and now we're trying to say, well, actually, that's an unsustainable life, and it would be better if everyone else didn't live that, which is fundamentally unfair, but it's also kind of the fate of the world depends on it. But the thing about the Yellow Sea developments, though, is that a lot of it is to build factories and ports that are manufacturing products and shipping products out to countries like Australia. So the Korean cars that we buy, the Korean white goods that we buy, all the Chinese everything that we buy, we're the ones buying that stuff. We're implicated in this.
Habitat destruction is obviously the biggest short to medium term concern in terms of shorebirds being endangered. If we can't save enough habitat for them first, what threat does climate change pose, apart from obviously rising sea levels potentially inundating their home? Again, we get into the very finely tuned nature of their migration here.
The reason that they migrate to the Arctic is because for a very brief window in the year, for about 6 to 8 weeks of the year, the Arctic is just an extraordinarily happening place life-wise. There's a very, very brief window of the Arctic summer. It gets warm enough for the snow and the ice to melt. That forms enormous swamps. There's 24-hour sunlight, which means that all the plants are able to grow 24/7, shooting out new leaves, new berries and things. Insects, particularly mosquitoes, can breed. Eggs have been lying dormant, and they can breed in all the meltwater swamps. So there's billions and billions and billions of mosquitoes up there. It's all kicking off for about 6 to 8 weeks in June, July in the Arctic. And that makes it an incredibly attractive place for birds to go and raise their young. The timing, though, is very important. So the shorebirds need to, and they've evolved to arrive at the Arctic just as the insect population is at its peak, or perhaps just prior to the insect population being at its peak. They'll arrive in the Arctic, they'll do their display flights, they'll get down to business, they'll lay a few eggs in this little hollow that they scrape in the ground. The eggs will be incubated for about a month. The chicks will hatch, and shorebird chicks are what's called precocial, as in precocious. From the instant they hatch, they can look after themselves. The instant they hatch, much like the brush turkey chicks, the instant they hatch, they can run around, they can feed themselves, and because there are so many insects in the air, feeding themselves is basically a matter of opening their mouths and letting the food fly in. And that's great if everything is happening as it should be, but the Arctic, the Arctic summer now starts 3 weeks earlier than it did 30 years ago. Which means that now by the time shorebirds get up there, the insects are bred, because insect life cycles of course are very short. The insects are bred and then the population is gone. There's flow-on cascading effects, then the young don't have as much food, then they're not as large, then when they get, then they have to delay their migration, or then have to have a slower migration. When they get to the mudflats, they're not able to feed on the same resource, so they have to. There was a study with great knots, which found that a lot of the young now, because they have been developmentally stunted from the start, their beaks haven't grown as much, which means they can't reach the clams that they have to feed on, which means that they have to go to an alternative food source, which is the roots of plants. And if you live in a very energy-intensive lifestyle, like migrating 10,000 kilometres, you can imagine the difference it makes between eating clams and eating plants. There is, though, I went to a talk at BirdLife Australia in Melbourne just a few weeks ago, and the talk was from a shorebird researcher, and he said there is some evidence from a couple of studies of redneck stints, I think, which are very, very small shorebirds, and ruddy turnstones, that they are starting to adjust their migration time and migrating earlier, so fingers crossed.
Well, that's a good point for me to... I've got one last one before throwing to the audience. It probably has been a somewhat bleak discussion for many of us here, and very sad, but a nice theme that comes up in the book's middle section is that whenever you set up your scope in China or Korea, there'd be curious parents and their kids, wanting to have a gander at these birds themselves that they might otherwise never have noticed. Can you give us something hopeful to leave us with, so we don't all go home too sad?
I went to China. This is my first ever time travelling in Asia, actually. I was travelling by myself, and the first place I ended up, because it was where the shorebirds went, just happened to be a place called Dandong, which is the major border city between China and North Korea. So I could literally see North Korea from my hotel window.
It's like Sarah Palin.
Exactly.
Flies on foreign policy.
The political opposite of Sarah Palin. So I went down to Dandong Harbour, down to a nature reserve there called Yalujiang Nature Reserve, which is a nature reserve because of the mudflats. And I had my scope, my binoculars, and as soon as I started looking at things on the mud, people wanted to come up and have a look and say, "What are you looking at? What are you looking at?" And particularly kids, people held their kids up to the scope. And I had one really, really lovely little girl. It was so sweet. She got really excited. She didn't speak a word of English, of course. I don't speak a word of Chinese, of Mandarin. This little girl, she must have been 6, 7 years old maybe, and she was there with her mum down by the coast, and her mum picked her up, looked through the scope, and then they went off and went another way. And the little girl then ran up yelling something in that lovely sort of childlike timbre that all kids all over the world have, and sort of yelling something out in Mandarin to me and sort of tapping me on the shoulder. And her mum came over, her mum did speak a bit of English, and her mum said, "She just wanted to let you know that she just saw some more of the birds over there." So the kids are our future.
That's a lovely place to put the audience in the frame. So we only have time for a couple of questions. Does anyone here have a
it in how long it takes for the 10,000 migration?
So there's one really famous example of shorebird, one of the larger shorebirds, which is slightly smaller than an Eastern Curlew. It's one called a bar-tailed Godwit, and there was a satellite tracking study. And for whatever reason, the bar-tailed Godwits follow the opposite migration strategy to most other shorebirds. Most shorebirds fly very quickly north and then take their way down south because there's not the time pressure when they're flying south. The bar-tailed Godwit, for whatever reason, that flies up to the LSE and then spends about a month hanging out at the LSE and then flies up, and then its southward migration is very fast and very direct, and a lot of them go to New Zealand. So there's one famous study, satellite tracking study of bar-tailed Godwits, and one individual, the female, called E7, was satellite tracked flying in a big arc over the ocean. So they don't even go in a straight line, it's kind of a big arc because they follow the magnetic fields of the Earth. It was about 11,000 kilometres from Siberia to New Zealand in a single non-stop flight that lasted 9 days.
Wow. It's amazing. It's amazing. Any other questions from the audience?
Wow.
There's a
I
question.
have about 5 questions.
Or maybe just one. We don't have much time, so maybe just one.
I'll just put in one thing. Bramble Bay, Sandgate, Brighton, it's not mud, it is actually sand.
Yep.
So it's more than just mud in Moreton Bay.
That's
What are the evolutionary pressures of a bird with a slow wing flap rate and a downturned beak?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know specifically what the evolutionary pressures of
Well,
the particular form, but the sheer size of an Eastern Curlew does present problems because they need to get so much food, and in fact quite a lot of juvenile Eastern Curlews, like first or second year Eastern Curlews, actually spend the whole winter in Australia. They don't migrate until they're a bit older, and that's partly because learning to so they have this long burrow because they mainly feed on crabs. So they have this long bill because they mainly feed on crabs, and so they sort of use it to kind of winkle down the burrow. And I've watched them, and it's an incredible process. They sort of twist their head upside down and get right, face deep into the mud and come up with, if they're lucky, they come up with a crab. So it's quite a difficult skill, and it takes time to perfect. And not all of the young ones are able to pile on enough food, get enough food quickly enough to migrate. So that's certainly an issue, largely due to the great size of the Eastern Curlews compared to other shorebirds.
The aerodynamics of a
Yeah, I don't look. I don't know if anyone's put an Eastern Curlew in a wind tunnel. But
Another quick one, if I may. How can I easily identify Wimbrels, little curlews, and Eastern curlews at a distance?
I think perhaps for the sake of everyone here, we can take you through that one afterwards. Both of us would be happy to. Not necessarily sure that everyone else needs that sort of fine level of detail just now. One thing I would like to speak to very quickly before we wrap up is something that probably affects most of us, or perhaps haven't thought about before. Hopefully, one thing that's come through this discussion is that when animals are this finely tuned in their evolutionary requirements, a little bit of disturbance means a lot. And that's where I might get Harry to just very quickly speak to why not leashing your dog on a beach or a walk along the bay can actually be a big problem.
Yeah. So
it gets back to what we've been saying earlier. These birds have to feed literally non-stop.
Yeah, so Eastern Curlews in particular are notorious among people who study shorebirds for being very flighty. If they see you at a distance, they'll take off. The easiest way to think about it is each joule of energy that's expended on flapping the wings to get away from a dog is a joule of energy that needs to be then made up again later. So each wing flap to escape from a perceived predator is a wing flap that's basically stolen against future migration.
Thank you. I think one more question and then we'll have to wrap up. So, yeah.
How do they sleep when they can't?
From memory, they do the micro sleep thing. So they do like the half brain, like the hemisphere sleep thing, like dolphins. So they're sort of sleep. Yeah, for like a few seconds at a time, kind of thing. So yeah, it's just look, it's a terrible lifestyle. Don't be a migratory shorebird.
That's one thing that probably many people are aware of when we're trying to recover endangered species. The hardest ones to get back, like orange-bellied parrots, for example, in Tasmania, are migrants, because it's very, very difficult to very difficult to treat a captive bred bird that it has to cross Bass Strait, or in this case, there's absolutely no chance we'll be able to bring back long-distance migrants like a curlew.
There have been some somewhat successful captive breeding
successful with
throughout
geese
Spoon-Billed,
and cranes,
but also even the Spoon-Billed Sandpiper.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
They're captive breeding Spoon-Billed Sandpipers in England.
Good. That really shows how hardwired this is. All right, well, I think we do need to wrap it up.
Yeah, we do need to wrap it up. This has been a fascinating conversation. I learned so much as a non-birder, so I'm sure that everybody here has had a really great time. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Harry.